and welcome to Meet the Author, a program that is brought to you by Quincy Access Television and the Thomas Crane Public Library. During this show, we will highlight authors and their work. Copies of their books are available for checkout at the Thomas Crane Public Library. Also, the library hosts book clubs for all ages, and you can find out more information about them if you visit the library's website, thomascranelibrary.org.
Summer of 2014 was kind of known as the summer of market baskets. It really was the moniker that it earned after the controversy during that whole tumultuous time. Grant Welker has put together a book about that experience. It's called We Are Market Basket. He's here right now to give us a little preview. So Grant, welcome. Thanks for coming over.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
I was wondering when somebody was going to write a book about that whole side. I'm sure there's probably going to be a movie at some point as well.
Well, there are two documentaries in the
Exactly.
works. I've been lucky enough to be interviewed for both, so I can't wait till those come out pretty soon. Yeah, I mean, it was a fantastic story. It only made sense to be a book and be a documentary, and who knows what else.
Sure. So tell us first about yourself.
Sure. So I'm originally from Plymouth, so I'm a South Shore guy.
Oh, okay.
I started my career for the Fall River paper, the Herald News. I was there for almost 6 years before coming up to Lowell. And I've been there for about 3 years. Like a lot of people south of Boston, they knew a little bit about Market Basket. They knew it had a fanatical following, but not really much necessarily beyond that until I came across the story a few years ago.
Okay. So Lowell, actually, Market Basket's based in Tewksbury, right?
Yeah, it's based, Tewksbury's a town right next door. It got its start almost 100 years ago, right in the middle of Lowell. So that whole area feels like they kind of own Market Basket. Like, Market Basket is the Merrimack Valley and vice versa.
Yeah,
so it's
like
really
our Stop and Shop down here, I guess.
Yeah, it's so ingrained in that whole area that it's something else.
So did you cover the strike for the Lowell Sun?
Yep.
You did, okay.
Yeah, and in fact, I didn't know, as I said, I didn't know a ton about the company. And about 2 years ago, what happened was Arthur T. DeMollis, the head of Market Basket, came in to see us. And one of my editors, who has been there for about 30 years, knows the company really well, knew something was up, that here was Arthur T. coming in to talk to the newspaper. That was really unusual because, as is his style and the company's style, they kind of just stick to business. They're not out in the public much. They don't advertise, for instance, because they don't need to, being such a cult, having such a cult following. And what happened in that case was, knowing the family's history, they have a lot of acrimony, the two sides, Arthur T. felt like he was going to be fired. So he was coming in to see us to sort of state his case publicly for why he had done such a well job with the company and why he deserved to stay on.
Talk about getting a scoop. For a newspaper editor.
So I kind of got a real crash course on Market Basket from that point on, really learning quickly what the company was all about. And it was just right from the get-go, I learned quickly the employees and the customers are just, they're so crazy about the Market Basket culture and everything about it that they fought to preserve that. Very quickly, they knew they had to put it all on the line for Arthur T. They showed up at rallies by the hundreds.
They made national headlines.
Yeah, and especially beginning, so that was in 2013 when the story kind of first started, but by 2014, last year, when Arthur T. was fired, it was shortly after that the rallies really started and the boycotts, and that's when it turned into a national story. There's never anything quite like it before.
The whole question arises, Grant, why? Why was the employees, the unorganized, non-union employees, so passionate about Arthur T?
And that's what made it such an unusual story too, is that it wasn't a typical union action. They didn't have the backing you would normally have of a union. In fact, they said
grassroots at its ultimate level.
It sounds like a cliche, but it really was a grassroots movement. It just kind of organically, it seemed like, from the people, the employees and a lot of the managers who had been working there for decades. A lot of those top managers who kind of ran the rallies last summer had been working there 30, 40 years in a lot of cases. They started out as baggers.
That's right.
Or, you know, they're corralling the grocery carts out in the parking lot, and they worked their way up. That's one of the things that people really loved about working there in the company culture is you work hard and you do well, and you have a chance to move up.
Right.
They typically hire from within. They're not going to hire some new MBA grad to fill your spot.
Right.
They say, you know, if your manager, your boss asks you to do something, they can do that because they once did that themselves. And that's that kind of feeds into that whole culture of the Market Basket way. They treat their employees very well. They pay them well. They get profit sharing, bonuses. And that ability to move up, that's something that everyone wanted to hold on to. And from the customer's perspective, it's always been the lowest prices around, great customer service. You go in there and you ask for something, and they don't just say, oh, you know, that's in aisle 6. They'll walk you down and they'll show you exactly where it is. And that's something that people did not want to lose.
In fact, the customers joined the workers.
Yeah, and that was what made the whole thing possible.
That's right.
Is Market Basket lost 90% or more of their sales during the 6 weeks of this boycott.
Right.
And I don't think it ever would have been possible if not for the customers. Really, pretty much unanimously, they decided they would go to Stop and Shop, Shaw's, Hannaford, all of the biggest competitors to Market Basket, to show that they were not willing to shop there unless Arthur T. was at the helm.
Right.
Just as the employees were not willing to work for anyone else.
They went so far as to stick their receipts on the windows.
Yeah, I always mention that because that's really one of the
stores.
that's one of the best images from last summer. Is not only were they willing to go often pay more at some of the competitors,
Right.
they kind of uproot their habits. You know, grocery shopping is such a habitual thing.
Oh,
You can kind of go in there and know exactly where you need to go to find what you need. And then in a lot of cases, they on their way back home,
Yep.
they would stop at their Market Basket and and tape the receipt up as sort of a sign of, you know, hey, we mean
Solidarity,
business. Yeah,
yeah.
this is. In a lot of cases, they would circle the total at the
That's
bottom
right.
and say, this is how much money you're losing by firing Arthur T. and then not putting him back in charge.
While you were covering this, how did you think the end was going to come out? You know?
Well, a lot of reporters are typically kind of skeptical. You sort of have to be able to look at it and not kind of get caught up in the rush too much. So when the employees first said, they demanded Arthur T. back the middle of last July. They said we're not going to work for anybody else. And you kind of think, people bluff a lot of times. Hey, we're not working for anybody else. We mean it. We're going to walk out. But they meant it. They walked out.
Yeah.
And it was amazing that it took that long, I think, to sort of settle itself. Over the span of about 6 weeks, things got more and more bleak. Within a few days of this, we'll call it a strike, starting, you started to see produce not showing up, fresh meat and fish, because they had halted the deliveries. Eventually, more and more empty shelves you would see in the aisles.
Because the drivers also work for Market Basket. That's
Right.
part of the culture is it's all inclusive.
It's all inclusive, yeah. And a lot of the front office workers and people in the warehouse, when walked out immediately, you'd go to the stores and those would still be staffed.
Right.
But they didn't have people to check out. They didn't have many things to stock in the aisles. But really, yeah, it reached a point towards the end where it felt like the company was maybe close to going under, because for how long can you lose 90% of your sales? And for a lot of part-time workers who eventually they weren't laid off technically, but they had their hours reduced to
Certainly,
zero.
yeah.
So it was getting kind of desperate where people didn't have the paycheck anymore, and it was getting frantic, I think, towards the end.
So what's the goal of the book, Grant? What is the ultimate mission of the book?
We really just tell the story of, as we call it, the grassroots efforts to save this beloved company.
Okay.
There are a lot of lessons, I think, to be learned in the business world more broadly, not even just in the supermarket industry. Like a question we ask is, if you're a CEO, if you're the head of any company, and you were to be fired, would your employees walk out for you? Would your shoppers leave in droves?
Do you ask other CEOs in the book that question?
Well, we talked to the head of Jordan's, Elliot,
Yep.
because he is a similar circumstance as a family-run business.
Right.
And we kind of leave it out there for sort of others to
All right.
answer themselves. And I know he was saying I think he wasn't sure. I mean, who knows until
Okay.
it happens? But I think if the answer is yes, you think that your employees would not walk out for you, or the answer is no, that they wouldn't, that probably says a lot about your management style or your company culture. And in terms of the way that the new CEOs handle things, there's some public relations lessons I think to be learned. And just looking at you wouldn't instinctively maybe think of it as a business theory or school of thought, but the way that Arthur T. and his close executives ran the business that's a way of doing things. You treat your employees well, you pay them better, but happy employees do better. They're better to the customers, and it all just kind of works in a circular way
Okay.
that the company has always done really well.
So it's a book for people interested in this story. If it's a book for CEOs, perhaps it's a
I
book
think
for,
it- yeah, I
for
think
the
it's a
corporate
book-
shelves. Yeah.
It's a book for everyone. Daniel, my co-author, did a great job in lending his business expertise. Through my reporting at The Sun, I've written dozens of stories, so we were able to incorporate a lot of that, talking to a lot of longtime employees and customers, vendors who also got involved. We made sure that it's a book anyone can read.
Okay.
I think it's a powerful lesson for academics, for business schools, and there's never been anything quite like it. So it suits itself really well for a book.
Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you.
Great
It's
to
nice
have you
be
back.
here again.
Great to have you in the studio. Murder and Mayhem in Boston.
The book actually grew out of this lecture. I've been doing this lecture for 4 or 5 years. It's the lecture is Mass Murder, Massachusetts' most infamous murder cases. And I was contacted by the History Press, and they said, "Would you like to do a book based on this?" And I said, "Fine, yeah, sure, that's great." But they wanted it focused on Boston. So the book is actually somewhat some of the cases from the lecture, but it's also other cases that just have to do with Boston. I had to actually go back and do a lot of research for the book and find new cases, Boston cases, which some of them I didn't even know about, and it was really fascinating to find some of these unknown, buried, long forgotten murder cases.
We'll get to those teaser in just a moment. Talk about yourself and your history as an author and a teacher.
Well, I've been interested in history all my life since I was a little kid. And my interest tends to be towards true crime, things that really jump out at you. Not so much interested in the mundane, like, the Bretton Woods Agreement or stuff like that. So I went to become a teacher years ago. I've been teaching for I think this is my 18th year teaching. And I thought it'd be good to start doing maybe little lectures on the side as something to get noticed as a teacher. And I became involved in the Pembroke Historical Society, and that was kind of the outlet for that. And it worked out very well. These first lectures I did, first one I did was on the Sacco Vanzetti case. And I decided to take it on the road, and it just grew from there. Over the years, I've been doing it for over 20 years now, and now I've got 8 or 9 lectures that I do. And Mass Murder is one of those lectures, and as I say, the book grew out of this lecture.
In the book, Murder and Mayhem in Boston,
Right.
there are multiple stories.
Right.
Pick out a couple to talk about briefly.
Well, the one, we should talk, I guess, the one that has a Quincy connection. There was a case called the Asquith case. It's also, you might have heard of it, the Merry Widow case. Some body parts washed up in Boston Harbor. Here's the Boston connection. And this was traced to a bungalow in Weymouth. Without giving the whole thing away, it turned out that the murderer was one Oscar Bartolini, who was from Quincy. He was a butcher and part-time handyman, lived up on Washington Street below a curtain shop.
Not far from us here. At
No,
QATV.
not just up the road from us. Yes, yeah. So, and this is a particularly gruesome case. And when you read about it, you might want to shut the book at some points. It really gets pretty gruesome. The chapter is called Dismembered, to give you an idea about it. Some of the other cases, one of my favorite ones is the first chapter, which is about Maria Bickford, who was this young girl from Maine. And she thought living in Maine was kind of boring and left her husband for the gay life in Boston. As it turns out, pretty quickly she degenerated into prostitution and the life of drinking and trying to find that man, that rich man to latch on to. And she went through a series of rich paramours, which eventually ended up in her demise. One of her paramours ended up killing her. But the reason why this is such an interesting case was his defense at trial was that he killed her while sleepwalking. And this is a very famous case. As I came across it, it was somewhat buried because it had been long forgotten. This happened in the 1840s over down near Charles Street in Boston.
Moving up to the 70s, 1970
Right.
murders in Boston.
Right.
The culprit known as the Giggler.
The Giggler. That was a real fascinating case because I actually, through my research, came across Detective Jack Daly, no relation to me, who is now living in Marshfield, and he himself wrote a book. And he was on the Giggler case, and I got to correspond with him and actually met him and talked to him. And he gave me some real insight into the Giggler case, and that was really great to have that information for that chapter. That's something that is, if you do research on the case, there's very little mentioned on it. But when you do a count of the victims, this guy was every bit as lethal as the Boston Strangler, but you never hear about him.
Talk about the youngest serial killer.
The youngest serial killer, that would be Jesse Pomeroy. And in the 1870s, he started out luring young boys away and torturing them. But he'd always let them go. And he himself was 12 or 13 at the time. And he was sent away to reform school. And through his mother writing letters and whatnot, he was given an early release. And the authorities didn't know it. And bodies started turning up. And then when one of the officers said, if I didn't know that boy was locked up in the reformatory, I'd think it was him. And one of the other officers said, he's out. And they knew who the murderer was. And when I wrote the book, one of his victims, the site where he was murdered is a site that we drive by every day if you go into Boston. I've driven by it hundreds of times. When you're on the Southeast Expressway, you're going by that gas tank, and everybody's always looking for the Ho Chi Minh outline there.
Right.
Right there on Savin Hill Beach is where he killed one of his victims. And instead of looking for Ho Chi Minh, when I go by there all the time, I go, there's where Horace Millen was left. So, and I always say to people, once you read this book, when you go by that gas tank, you'll never think of it the same.
Talk about compiling the book. Your wife was involved as well?
Right. My wife is a professional photographer, lucky for me. And a lot of the sites...
they go hand in hand?
It really worked out very well because a lot of the sites are still there. Through a little digging and research, we were able to photograph some of the sites as they exist today. And she was part of that, a big part of that. And her photographs are wonderful because she used a wide-angle lens, and it just made some of the pictures look so kind of daunting and scary. So it was perfect for the book.
The book is titled Murder and Mayhem in Boston. I want to thank you, Chris, for stopping by. Good luck with the book.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Chuck, thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Great to be here, Joe. Thanks.
Appreciate the opportunity to tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, if you could, and then we'll get into this project.
I have been working for about 25 years on these issues of growing income and wealth inequality in the United States, the growing gap between rich and poor. I wish I could report that we've made some kind of progress in reducing it, but we haven't. And the perspective I bring to this book is actually that I grew up in the 1%. So I'm the great-grandson of the meatpacker Oscar Mayer.
Oh.
So my dad used to say bringing home the bacon means something different in our family.
Right. Interesting.
But I wanted to talk about more about how Advantage works, because more and more people are kind of in the circumstance I grew up in, which is being born on third base. There's all kinds of both sort of visible and invisible ways in which that creates opportunities and advantages. So I bring that perspective to this discussion of inequality.
Okay. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? Where do you live now? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, well, I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit.
Okay.
And I went to a private high school, Cranbrook School, which is where Mitt Romney went.
Oh.
So it's kind of a boys' private school preparing us to lead the world.
Sure.
And but I've lived in Massachusetts. Actually, when I was 17, I moved to Worcester and eventually went to college in the western part of the state. But I live in Jamaica Plain, and I've lived there for almost 25 years and raised a couple kids there.
And professionally, what, is authoring your profession, or what?
No, it's not my day job.
Okay.
I work, I'm a researcher at the Institute for Policy Studies.
Okay.
And actually co-edit a website called inequality.org, and I direct this program of research that looks at these issues of what's happening to income, what's happening to work, what's happening to wealth.
What led you to that field, Chuck? I'm curious, growing up, as you say yourself, kind of privileged, why so interested in that area?
I grew up in kind of the equivalent of Weston.
Okay.
Yeah, outside Detroit, a kind of wealthy suburb. But when I was 7, which was 50 years ago this summer, was the Detroit riots, the uprising in Detroit. And I remember my mom, who had a lot of sensibilities about fairness, saying, this has to do with the enormous gap between city and suburb, rich and poor, black and white. So that kind of planted this little seed in my life, which was, we live in a time of inequality. And then even in my first job, I worked with tenants in mobile home parks who were trying to get it together to buy the land under their parks, and I was kind of their technical assistant. And I had this very intimate front row seat in the 1980s into the 1990s of how people were surviving as wages were starting to flatten out and begin to fall. And at the same time, growing up in a wealthy family, I had the experience of seeing how wealth was growing and multiplying for people in my circumstances. So that really is what tuned me into the ways in which these inequalities actually undermine a lot of what we care about.
Okay. Tell us about Born on Third Base and your research into this project and what you hope that comes out of it.
Well, one thing I want to do through Born on Third Base is just talk about what these current levels of inequality mean. Half the population has not seen their real wages go up. The concentration of wealth is getting greater. Most of the income and wealth gains of the last 10 years have gone to the top, not the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. So that has, I think, really negative consequences on our democracy, on the education system, on the economy. So part of my motivation for this book is to just have conversations.
Does the book have a timeline? Does it have a theme, a storyline to it?
Well, what I try to do is tell stories about how people think about these inequalities, because it's not just the facts and the data that are holding us back. We have ways of thinking about inequality that kind of justify it and explain it, but I think actually keep us from understanding why it matters. For instance, I think most people say, oh, well, the wealthy deserve the wealth they have because they work harder and they create things that we all care about. And if people don't have economic security, it's mostly their fault. That's sort of the dominant story in our culture. And what I want to do is both tell the story of, well, actually, if you are someone like me and you're born on third base, you have a huge wind at your back.
You're almost home, right?
You're almost home.
Yeah.
And the rules of the economy now make it harder for people who are not born on third base to make it in the economy. So mobility is declining in the United States. I mean, that's the American dream, right? That you get up and you work hard and you apply yourself, you can make it. So part of Born on Third Base is to look at the stories that hold inequality in place and kind of help us shift our lens a little bit.
So do you, in the book, do you talk to folks who are experiencing that? You do?
I do. I
Yeah.
talk to people who are both struggling with economic inequality, and I also talk to people who have a lot of wealth, but are aware and tell their story through the lens of, what was the help that they got along the way, whether it was, family help or public investments or subsidies or debt-free college loans and whatever, things that sort of help propel them along. And I think that's kind of the hidden history or the hidden story behind inequality.
Were folks, did you find on both sides willing to share their stories with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really?
Some people wanted to be anonymous, but most of the time I was just able to tell the stories that that hold these inequalities in place.
Yeah. And you've done other projects on the same topic, right? So this is not new to you.
Yes,
Yeah.
I've written a couple of books on these trends of inequality. They tend to be, to be honest, kind of more boring books.
Okay.
And this is my attempt to actually liven up this topic, to really make it connect to our lives and our experience.
Were you motivated at all by, obviously the current political culture and national conversation about this issue?
Very much.
Yeah.
And actually, I think the election that we've just lived through really was an inequality election. If half the population for 40 years has not really felt or not really shared in the productivity gains, then that creates a certain amount of anger and a sense of betrayal. And that can go, it creates a populist anger, and it can go progressive populism, like a Bernie Sanders saying, the concentration of wealth and corporate power is really what's making life bad for us. But it can also go, I would call it regressive populism, where you sort of focus on new immigrants and people of color, and you sort of scapegoat powerless people as a way to address these inequalities.
Yeah.
But the underlying wound, if you will, is these inequalities of wealth and income.
So does the book motivate people to do anything? Are you trying to, affect change?
Very much so.
Really? Okay.
What are things that people can do, both as individuals and as a community? What are things that cities are doing to reduce inequality? What are things we can do in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? So it's not just a dreary bad news program. I really hope to inspire people to see that it doesn't have to be this way. For instance, 44 million people in this country are paying off student debt. Those are the students and in some cases the parents.
Yes.
And whereas 50 years ago, we helped tens of millions of people get debt-free college educations that really propelled and expanded the middle class after World War II. So I think we need to build a movement to address this issue of this enormous student debt issue. That's just one example of something I think we can really make a difference on. The other thing is to just go to inequality.org, which is the foremost, sort of portal for information on these issues, and we have a lot of articles, and try to both have a sense of humor as well as just looking at sometimes the bleak picture.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we want to thank you for coming by and sharing a little bit about your project with us.
Thank you for joining me for Meet the Author. Be sure to check out our other episodes of this program to explore other authors and their works. For more information about library programs and services, visit the Thomas Crane Public Library's website, thomascranelibrary.org, or call them at 617-376-1316.